I want to make a video about why I think deathcore is in a massive decline and setting itself up for an even bigger decline, most likely falling into a little bit of irrelevance. Spoken as a longtime admirer of someone who adores this genre of music and wants to see it succeed, I notice a lot of glaring issues with the genre that I wanted to bring to the table just as some food for thought, so let's get right into it. There's a major issue and discussion to be had with modern deathcore that the vast majority of people love to ignore. But if I've proven one thing on this platform, it is the fact that I am willing to go there. So before all the angry comments, let me cook and give you my own perspective, because trust when I say this video is coming from a place of a love letter to a genre that I adore. But deathcore, it's not in a great spot right now. So, like, on the surface, the success levels of it, yes, it's doing fine. It's actually doing better than it has in quite a few years. But deathcore has always had this ebb and flow. It's always been a damn roller coaster. It goes here and there and everywhere. Its general popularity cannot stay for the life of it in one place for too long. It is either dominating conversations or it is practically non-existent outside of people who are predisposed to listen to it anyway. And after bands like Whitechapel and Bring Me the Horizon, Suicide Silence, All Shall Perish, Thy Art Is Murder brought deathcore into the mainstream metal sphere, it sort of slowly but surely died away as many of the bands that were hallmark bands started to gradually shift their style away from it. With even classics like Veil of Maya, Born of Osiris, Job for a Cowboy, Bring Me the Horizon slowly but surely moving away from their original deathcore stylings. And then of course it also just went hand in hand with other genres taking its place. Progressive metalcore and gent were taking off around that time, black gaze was becoming a very big point of reference in the metal community, and so deathcore was no longer the cool kid on the block to talk about. But what this did is it sort of left this vacuum space. It was the Wild West time of deathcore, where there were no expectations of the genre. Many of the bands that were considered namesake bands had either changed their style so drastically they were unrecognizable for their genre roots, or alternatively, became so subpar, releasing mediocre after mediocre release that just tanked their reputation, so people only wanted to listen to the classics. And that of course opened the gateway for a lot of other bands to take their place, either making music that was very similar to the golden age of deathcore, or alternatively, the thing that gives genres longevity, experimenting. From this point forward, there were so many diverging paths of deathcore. You had bands that took the progressive metalcore and gent stylings and brought them into deathcore. I'm looking at Within the Ruins, some of mid-level Born of Osiris's discography. Those sorts of bands were really awesome. There was a lot of experimentation coming from technicality and progression. When you look at bands like Shadow of Intent, there were bands that were incredibly technical and very fast. It was their entire shtick. Signs of the Swarm, Shadow of Intent were very technical, or even a band like Jabalba is a great example of a very experimental, weird take on deathcore that wasn't entirely deathcore. And then you had the band that I 100% give full credit to the new wave of deathcore to, Infant Annihilator, who showed that you could have 10 breakdowns in a song. It could have a song that was 10 minutes long and sounded like a skyscraper on top of another skyscraper, fucking the other skyscraper. Long story short, deathcore was in a position where experimentation reigned free, and I think that was a beautiful time in deathcore, and a time in deathcore that produced some of the best material in the entire genre. But then something shifted. Infant Annihilator went completely, utterly viral. Reaction channels, reviewers, publications were reacting to their material with so much shock and awe, and it was drawing up so much publicity because every time someone heard it, they wanted to see what someone's reaction would be. Now, of course, metal reaction content had already existed, and there were plenty of classic metal reviewers, but you didn't really see that many metal reactors. Reaction channels were still kind of getting their start up, but the bands that got reacted to in the metal sphere that people wanted to see were obviously going to be bands that were heavily provocative and very different, very off the beaten path. And even putting aside the subgenre of non-metalheads reacting to metal, because I know that is a whole thing, I'm talking strictly metalheads reacting to stuff. They're obviously not going to want to react to things that everyone knows already that sounds exactly the same as something they've heard before, so it has to be something that makes an impact. And that's exactly what the new wave of deathcore became obsessed with. It became obsessed with loudness, it became obsessed with the breakdown. I've made multiple videos about how the loudness war, and specifically deathcore's obsession and metalcore's obsession with breakdowns in the modern sphere, make them feel creatively bankrupt more often than not, because no longer are there fully fleshed out songs with great replayability. It is instead replaced with a song that is entirely constructed to be built around that breakdown, that crescendo, that mighty moment that's going to get people in the thumbnail with a red arrow pointing to them going like this. That is exactly what a lot of modern deathcore has become. And of course, this was even more amplified when you had Lorna Shore and Slaughter to Prevail burst on the scene with massive numbers that we hadn't seen for deathcore in a decade plus, if ever. Now you can attribute that to a lot of things, Will Ramos just being a cool dude in the modern era. Lorna was also big before, but it was specifically the Will Ramos era that has gotten them as much acclaim as it has. And of course, Alex Terrible had this resume already of his YouTube channel and how he did like covers where he'd do metal vocals over pop instrumentals and that sort of thing, pop songs and metal covers in general. So you can chalk it up to a lot of things. You can say either Lorna Shore are just crazy, or you can say Slaughter to Prevail, or, you know, this manly, beefy Russian deathcore band with crazy, grisly lows. That's the thing. They absolutely deserve their flowers, but it's everything that came after them that is fucking the genre up. It is the standards that this specific era of deathcore set that I think is going to, in the long term, completely kill the longevity of it, and probably send it back down where it was, of being semi-irrelevant to most people. No longer can you just have a deathcore song that is experimental in some way. It always has to be so chromatic, or it has to be so distorted, and you have to have amazingly large breakdowns. You have to exceed it. You know when it's building up to it. Everyone knows when a deathcore drop's about to happen, and that is what you are playing for, because you know that if you do not set the bar so high or push the envelope past the 50 other bands that just released a song the other day, you are going to fall behind and no one is going to care about you. And don't get me wrong, it is an extremely sad way of having to produce your music. And obviously creators have a hand in this, but it isn't their fault that they're reacting to music that people want to see them react to. It's a very similar effect to what happened to Architects back in the day, when there was this whole massive crop of metalcore bands, both established and not, that wanted so desperately to be the next Architects that they just copycatted them. Even well-established bands tried to do that. I remember when Wage War tried to sound like fucking Architects. And it's unfortunate to say, I think you're seeing this now with older bands feeling this immense amount of pressure on them to sort of either exceed expectations or show that you aren't just washed up and that you can't get with the times. That's a big thing that I felt about the new Whitechapel album. I fucking love Whitechapel, man. They're an OG, they're classic as hell, and I actually really enjoyed this album, don't get me wrong, but I'd be lying if I said that I didn't notice how much they are trying to pander to this new crowd in a way that felt oddly uncharacteristic. Whitechapel has always been raw and primal and brutal. That's always been a part of their identity, except for a couple of ballads here and again in the Valley and stuff. But Whitechapel's version of deathcore felt much more aligned with like the classic form of deathcore that they would fine tweak throughout time to feel uniquely theirs. And on this album, Phil sounds monstrous, he sounds ferocious, the mixing is humongous, the breakdowns are gigantic, and just overall the playing is very intense and very fierce and tenacious. But considering people were kind of hard on the last two Whitechapel albums, and considering the place that deathcore is, it did exactly what they wanted it to, because I remember when they came back recently, when they released that first single, there were so many YouTubers reacting to it and saying that Whitechapel's back, they had to show who the deathcore daddies were, and it's just, I understand that's the position deathcore is in right now, but it is really saddening to me that even the bands that had a very unique style as is are falling prey to this wallpaper type of writing, where all of your music has to be as fierce and intense and brutal as possible. It doesn't matter if it's not memorable, it doesn't matter if it's intriguing, it just has to be as brutal and hard-hitting and gut-smashing as possible. But I know what you guys are thinking, what about symphonic deathcore, the style that came from Winds of Plague back in the 2000s and was later just thrown into international success by bands like Lorna Shore and Worm Shepherd, which I will say say is fair. I've actually deep dived symphonic deathcore before, and the sort of blackened symphonic deathcore style, I think it was a very healthy way to take the genre into new directions, and I think that the bands that incorporated it in a smart manner really did bring more quality into the genre and bring in a unique style. But the issue with that is, slowly but surely, symphonic deathcore got to this place where it felt incredibly manufactured and homogenous and devoid of life. It was so engineered and perfectly tweaked to sound inhumane and that it couldn't exist anywhere outside of a fucking lab. For every band that does it properly, like Jaluka and Lorna Shore and Worm Shepherd and Mental Cruelty, there are a ton of slamming, brutal deathcore bands that put symphonic elements into their style and have just caused the genre to grow incredibly stale because they just feel, like I said, like they were grown in a lab. Which unfortunately is just going to be the name of the game whenever there is a specific style of music that grows incredibly popular, incredibly fast, but what you're left with is an experience that cheapens the initial bands that made that genre important and that offshoot important to begin with, while also cheapening the bands that are coming along because they are just a subpar, mediocre version of the other bands that are already doing it better. So it helps no one in the long term and only damages the credibility of the genre as a whole. When truth be told, that's not what I want to hear all the time, and that's not what made me enjoy deathcore to begin with, and not what I think made a lot of people enjoy deathcore to begin with. If everything starts sounding the same, both the pre-existing bands that feel the need to fit these shoes now, as well as the biggest bands just competing off in a wank fest of who can make the gnarlier sound with their vocal cords or who can make the larger breakdown, and then circling that you have all of these mini-me's by the dozens, by the hundreds, just vulturing buzzards coming down trying to feast on the remains of whatever is left over from their music and making a more subpar version of it. It has been a hot minute since I have felt genuinely impressed with a deathcore release through and through. Now, with that being said, am I not impressed with how heavy they can make a mix, how heavy a breakdown is? Yeah, I'm gonna draw a stank face, and in the grand scheme of things, I enjoy the bands I'm talking about, so this is in no way like a hit piece. I'm just saying, I think deathcore is going down a road where it is going to end up dying or fall into more obscurity and irrelevance and go into a position where it has to claw itself back up again, and maybe we need that period to get some more people doing interesting stuff, because I am more than positive there is interesting stuff going on in the underground. There always is interesting stuff going on in the underground, but with that being said, I'm talking about right now. And right now, I just feel like deathcore's in a weird spot, because I don't want to listen to deathcore for the fucking breakdown. I want to listen to deathcore for the music. Because deathcore, similar to metalcore, had so many different branches to it, and so many different paths that you could go down, and so many ways that you could experiment with the style, and even if it did start off being very one note, it expanded into something that felt very intriguing and intelligent and all over the place. There was this free thinking mentality that existed where you could do anything, just like you could with metalcore. You could be very raw, you could be very well produced, you could have a lot of breakdowns, you could have no breakdowns or just one breakdown that's status quo, you could have vocals that were very monstrous, or you could have vocals that were very intelligent. You could take it in a very progressive and technical sort of way, or be very minimalistic and scant. There was no right or wrong way to make deathcore, and that period of time between about 2012 to 2019 of deathcore was peak in my opinion. Not even like the OG stuff, because obviously that had its era and those are the classics, but I specifically think that the 2010s period of deathcore, where everyone was trying everything, was incredible. So it just disappoints me a little bit to see us settle on a type of deathcore that is not only dominating the entire atmosphere at this point, but gets very tiresome very fast. And it makes me wonder if we're sort of in the danger zone of a genre playing itself out into a corner, because it's very hard to get me to not like deathcore, and in general I feel like a lot of modern deathcore just is not doing anything for me in terms of leaving just a lasting impact. But maybe that's just me at the end of the day. Just some food for thought. But what are your guys' opinions of this topic? You can let me know down in the comment section below. Agree or disagree, there is no wrong answer. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is, my name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.